from Oxford and then founded GroupSpaces, one of the leading startups in the London tech scene, funded by Index Ventures. On the side, he grew his app Selective Tweets to 1 million users, and all these by 26. Seriously, 26. You're younger than me. He is now an integral part in Stripe's mission to reinvent online payments. Andy will talk about how not to drown in startup advice, a topic absolutely vital to every Cypriot entrepreneur. Andy uses his 8 years in startups to explore how to sensibly navigate this information and draw useful, tangible conclusions to drive yourself forward. Please give a round of applause to Andy Young.
Hey everybody, I'm Andy. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this the right distance from the microphone? Hopefully good stuff. Yes, one guy said yes, so thanks. Cool. My name's Andy. Really nice to be here. I've actually been here on holiday in Cyprus. So I basically spent the whole week trying not to get sunburnt as the white British guy, then just to be laughed at by a room full of Cypriots. So it's really cool to be here. After having a great week here, it's really nice just to sort of give back a little bit as well. Hopefully I can share some things that are a little bit interesting in a more productive way than just spreading all my money and my dignity all over Ayia Napa. So hopefully some of what I have to say here could be interesting. Maybe just to introduce myself, thanks for introduction, but just so you know a little bit about who I am, so you can sort of figure out maybe a bit more about what I'm talking about. So I'm a startup guy, an engineer by background. I grew up, got led astray at a young age, learned to code on the ZX Spectrum, same as Dimitri actually. We're a couple of years apart in age, but grew up on the same computer. I studied computer science at university, but I think maybe being a software engineer myself, and also that my dad was self-employed and worked from home while I was growing up, I very quickly maybe inherited from him the lack of ability to work for anybody else. And then being someone who creates things, very quickly got my head around the idea that it was the idea of creating a product once and then selling it multiple times seemed to me more attractive than like working for an hourly wage. So very quickly while I was at university, got started setting up in small projects, small businesses. Eventually co-founded a company called GroupSpaces, which was membership management software. So software as a service, built that out of university, worked on it for a few years, raised a couple of $1 million, built it up, got several thousand customers. Thankfully mentioned in introduction, we made a lot of buzz in London. Then spent a couple of $1 million. And the company, it was a big learning experience. It didn't work out as a big business success. Basically, we got thousands of customers. We made money, but we didn't make enough money as we'd hoped. We'd aimed for the sky, and we didn't manage to get there. But it was a hell of a lot of fun, and I learned a huge amount along the way. And now, more recently, so this year, I joined another small startup called Stripe. And what we're doing with Stripe is payment processing, so making it easy to take card payments online. Founded by a couple of Irish guys 3 or 4 years ago. Started in the States, where we've been going now, launched for a couple of years, and now we're expanding across Europe. So I'm based in London, working on our international expansion into the UK and helping out with things there. So today, I thought I'd like to talk a little about advice, or how not to drown in startup advice. Based on my experiences running, setting up and running, a few startups, I've been very lucky with being able to attend a number of talks, learn from a lot of people, and I feel like I've really benefited from a lot of advice over the years. But take a step back, what is advice, first of all? So I quite like this quote from Paul Buchheit, creator of Gmail and now partner of Y Combinator. He says, "Limited life experiences and overgeneralization equals advice." I think, to be honest, that's pretty fair to say about most advice. It's a pretty cynical way of looking at the world, but when we're surrounded by receiving advice from everybody and taking it on board, I think it helps to step back and think, what is advice? So the great thing about advice, I think advice is great. It essentially, like Dimitrios said, shared some great advice there. That's really helpful. I've had many talks over the years. that have really helped me propel myself forward, where I think that I would have taken a lot further or maybe not gotten as far as I did without the benefit of other people's insights and learnings. So advice is one of our secret weapons, and the key thing for me for advice is benefiting from the learning of others. And so it basically speeds us along the way so we can get places faster and cheaper because other people have already been there and other people have already learned. So the key question for me is, when taking on advice, what is the best way that I can learn the things I need to know without having to go there and do it myself, all of it the hard way? So there's a lot of advice out there, as I mentioned: talks, books, blogs, tweets. I was just chatting with people earlier on today, and I think everyone agreed that there's no shortage of advice, and there's a wealth of things. Some of my favorites I've listed, and I'll post my slides up online later for anyone who's interested in sort of looking at the references. So advice is great, and there's a couple of different kinds of advice. I like to think about it in terms of generic advice, which is the stuff you read online. It's the stuff that talks about business in general, general principles, general guidelines, things like you should only try to hire people that are better than yourself, or you should look to raise as much money as you possibly can. Sort of catch-all phrases that aren't specific to what you're working on, but they're sort of what other people think, other people's advice that they give in general. Contrast that with specific advice, which is more the mentorship, more the things you get from sitting down and talking with people about specifically what you're working on. And so you can chat through your problems, and I've benefited a lot over the years from a lot of mentorship, which I've been very thankful for, to really sort of use as a sounding board and chat over the issues that I'm struggling with. So generic advice at this point, I don't know if anyone saw this post by Ev Williams, the co-founder, blogger, and Twitter. Like, all the startup advice you read is wrong, but you should read some anyway. Now, a great little short post there, 5 minutes of reading. As I say, I've shared the link. But basically what he's getting at is that it's kind of like Demetrios said, like, every situation is different. And so it's really hard to apply these generic sort of principles that other people, they have a limited experience, then they overgeneralize, and then they say something to you, and it sounds kind of interesting and kind of useful, but then it's really difficult to actually apply. Ev's point was that you should read it anyway, because it's useful in broadening your mind, opening yourself to new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. So onto specific advice. And the thing I'm thinking about here is the different places you can go for specific advice. So on my journey with GroupSpaces, as I mentioned, I was really lucky. I had a number of mentors that changed over the years. And what I had was I had different mentors for different stages of the company. So starting out, I had, when we were working on GroupSpaces, back in the early days, we got mentorship from a local businessman who'd set up his business over 17 odd years, grown a business organically, had no investment, no backing or anything, grown it, it was a software consultancy, he'd grown it to maybe 30, 40 people, and he gave us very generously an hour of his time every week for the first year and a half of the company, which was fantastic, because we were young folks, we didn't have a clue what we were doing, we were full of excitement about our latest and greatest ideas. And he brought us back down to earth with thinking about things like cash flow and where are we going to be in 1 year and projections, and that's a great idea, but does the whole picture make sense? And then as I grew the business, working with the team, we got more advice and mentorship from other people, in particular our investors that came on board. And first of all, when we raised angel investment, we had angel investors who brought on a new set of perspectives from the benefit of working with other businesses that they work with. There was kind of like a nice transition, a handover between like our original business advisor, who then took a step back because he had a lot of experience about building a business organically, but he didn't have experience about working with investment where you're trying to grow a company a bit faster. And then a similar thing happened when we took venture capital investment, where the venture investors who had experience with a whole different set of businesses came on board. But there's other places aside from your investors and people you're actually working with in the company where you can get advice. And one of them is just people who are traveling along the same journey. And I've found it not just a lot of fun, fun, but some of the best things I've learned have been from friends of mine, from colleagues, who, other people who are doing similar journeys at the same time, where you can just get together and talk things over. One of the things, just a tip on that point, which we found really well, that I picked up from someone, is when you're talking about your different issues, your different problems with your friends, it can be really tempting. Everyone suddenly gets really keen, really excited about giving advice. And we'll dive in with, oh yes, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. But to take a step back, what can really work well is if you, when you're having these discussions, you put in process a rule, which basically says, when someone sets out their problem that they have, that they're struggling with, you can't give them your opinion. You need to tell them a story which relates to your own personal experience. So rather than saying, I think you should do this, you can say, well, when I had a similar problem, I did this, and maybe it was successful, maybe it wasn't successful, but here's what I learned from it. And so this kind of storytelling, actually, it helps put a hold on things where otherwise, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to being inundated with everyone's feedback, which may or may not be particularly insightful. Another thing about investors, people use the phrase, I don't know if you've heard the phrase smart money versus dumb money, referring to investors that just give you cash versus investors that actually give you useful advice and useful input. I'm not sure how I feel about using the phrase dumb to describe someone who's decided to invest in your business. It seems ungrateful at best. My takeaway is that it comes from the valley on the west coast of America, where raising capital is perhaps a lot more easy. There's a lot more money flying around, and so it pays to be more discerning with who you take capital from. But it's definitely true, the saying that investing in a first-time entrepreneur is like paying for their education, which certainly I'm very grateful for the people that have backed me so far and have learnt a huge amount on their dime. My business partner did once come out with this phrase in an investment meeting where we were pitching for investments. It's like paying for a shot. I was like, no, shh. But yeah, it's all worked out in the end. So getting specific advice. Another tip that really worked well for us on our journey with GroupSpaces was just reaching out to people and asking for help. And so people we reached out to with no particular strong connection, people like Michael Birch, I don't know if you're familiar with, the guy who co-founded Bebo amongst many other internet companies. Other people like Michael Moritz, who's one of the best-known Valley investors, the Sequoia venture capital firm. We reached out to both of these people amongst other people during the early days of our journey and just said, hey, we're young people, we're working on our idea, we're trying to learn, we've seen what you've done, and we'd really like to sit down with you for 15, 20 minutes and tell you about what we're trying to do and get your advice, get your feedback. And the surprising maybe thing was that both of those guys, for example, amongst the others, shared their time, and we met up with them, and they were very, very helpful. And over time, I saw this pattern emerge with sort of people in general, and that the people who are maybe a little bit further along the journey with building companies or projects, or even a lot further along, are often very willing to share their time. So a tip is not to be afraid to reach out. Some sort of tips about how to go about that. Be very specific with your request. So, for example, I sometimes receive emails from myself from people who are maybe coming up from the journey of being a student entrepreneur, following a similar path that I have, and I'm very, very happy to help out. But it's very difficult for me if someone says, "Hey, can we chat sometime?" Because I'm trying to fit in a lot of things with the work I'm doing with Stripe, et cetera, et cetera. And it's much easier if someone says, I have this specific problem that I see that you did this specific thing that's very relevant, and therefore I'd like to ask you about it. And it's much easier for me to say, okay, sure, I can share that specific experience, and I'm also much more confident that I know I can maybe help out with that. Another thing that worked well for us was meeting people like Mike Moritz, the investor, to say, hey, well, we're going to be in town on such and such a date, and would you have 15 minutes to grab a coffee? And so it's much easier for people to say, okay, sure, I'll fit you in for 15 minutes. Whereas if you say something open-ended like, could we meet up at some point? And if you're trying to attract the attention of busy people, then it's very hard for them to say, to fit in that sort of generic request. So advice is great. It can really help propel ourselves forward, but problems with advice. So I already mentioned that I've had, discussed with people this morning about getting too much advice. Just where do you stop? You could spend your whole day reading the blogs, speaking to people, and not actually be a doer, like was mentioned earlier, not actually get anything done. Analysis paralysis sets in if you have too much information coming in and you just don't know what to do with it. Another thing I call the entrepreneur's dilemma, that most advice is contradictory. And the funny thing here is that, it's contradictory, but it's still valid. And that's back to the point that Evan Williams was going on about in his blog post about that every situation is different. So some examples of advice that I've heard or seen, people talk about having a clear vision and sticking with it. Startups are hard, you've got to persevere, but at the same time, you have to be prepared to change your idea or pivot. And how do you reconcile those two? Another strategy, people say it's a great thing to get a lot of users up front and just figure out monetization later. Other people will say, no, you should look to make money from your business in day one. I mean, these are both sort of valid pieces of advice, but completely the opposite. Raise more money than you need, or only raise just enough money as you need. Both pieces of advice, or maybe the most obvious one, hire your friends. Never hire your friends. So in a world where we're receiving all this crazy kind of contradictory advice, how on earth are we supposed to deal with it? And at one point, I stepped back, and it occurred to me like a way of bringing maybe a little bit of sanity to this world. So how to understand and interpret the advice that we get so that we can use it usefully. And a few questions came to mind for me when I was trying to do this. The first is, who is giving that advice? So for example, if it's someone who's an investor, they're giving that advice based on their experience of seeing a specific set of companies. If it's a friend of yours, then they have specific experiences that you may know about the problems they've worked with. If it's someone like Paul Graham, for example, at Y Combinator, you might speak to him for 5 minutes, and in that time he will know very little about your business. But he benefits from seeing hundreds of other startups and starts to see the patterns that emerge. So this is the question about who's giving the advice and what's the context. And also, what are they assuming? What is the thing that they are saying, not just you should do something, but here's the thing here, not just you should do X, not just you should raise as much money as possible, or you should always look to hire your friends, but assuming something, you should do X. And this is the thing that I think goes unsaid in a lot of advice, is the assuming part. And so we can go back through this and say, get a lot of users, figure out monetization later. What's the assumption there? And so if you start to think things like, well, the assumption there is something along the lines of, if we're trying to build a big consumer company, and we're doing it in a market where finding funding will be relatively straightforward if we can demonstrate traction. And traction in this case, the thing that investors are looking to back, is a large user base. And there is evidence out there that companies such as Twitter, such as Facebook, who have built large user bases, have then been successful figuring out how to make money later. That sort of plan makes a lot of sense. Whereas if you're trying to bootstrap a company, or you're trying to maybe sell business to business, getting a lot of users is great, but it doesn't pay the rent. And also, maybe if you're not trying to build a $1 billion company or bust sort of business, maybe you're trying to grow a business at a more manageable size, maybe your aspirations, are just of a different kind, then suddenly the second kind of advice starts to make more sense to you. Similar things here, like raise more money than you need, versus only raise as much money as you need. Well, only raising as much money as you need is about preserving equity in your company, not giving away too much control. Whereas raise more money than you need makes a lot more sense at a time in a market where capital is very easy to come across. And so, if you're in an environment where it's hard to access money, then the first kind of advice, raise as much money as you can, that can be not just unhelpful, but frustrating. I'm going to skip over that. So another point, deciphering the cliches. So I mentioned how I've been to many talks, and people start, like myself, stand up in front of you and roll off things based on their experiences, and they boil it down to simple things like focus. And you're like, focus, that sounds like a good thing. I should be focused. And people like me say, be focused. That's a good thing. And you're nodding your head. And say things like, focus on core. Okay, so the core, focus on core. Or this quote, which I love, the main thing is to keep the main thing, which comes from Stephen Covey, who's an American, one of these sort of self-help authors. And you look at this and you're like, well, hang on a minute. Like, I know I should be focused, but what does this even mean? Like, the main thing, okay, so there's one main thing that matters, and it's important not to get distracted. Keep the main thing, so I mustn't get distracted. Okay, that sounds sensible. But the main thing is to not get distracted. So I'm not even sure whether I agree that the main thing is not to get distracted in the universe of all the challenges and all the struggles that we go through, because the chances are that for many of us, we know exactly what we're trying to do, and we don't have any problems. And like people are saying, you should do this, and we're like, no, I know what I'm doing. So this kind of advice, this sort of cliches, the pithy one-liners, I find it to be much less value. But the thing here is, for me, maybe to talk you through my learnings about focus. And so it's like going back 6 or 7 years when I first saw someone stand up here and put the word focus on the screen. And I went away and I was like very motivated. I was like, great, I've got to be focused to be successful in my business. And that was my focus, if you like, level 1. Saying no to distractions. And certainly I relate to this, because in the early days of GroupSpaces, everyone we spoke to was like, oh, that's great, and also you should do this. I remember we had loads of discussions with a company that sold like printing on t-shirts, and they were speaking to us because we were targeting clubs and societies, and they said, you should make available within your site the ability for the clubs to buy t-shirts with their logos on within our site. Which was great, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the software that we were developing. So saying no to distractions was something that I learned sort of fairly quickly. And once you get in that mindset of just like the default is no, then suddenly the day by day becomes a lot more, a lot easier going, and we can just focus on doing what we set out to do. So that was focus level 1, and I thought, great, I'm focused now. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm not doing. But over time, I came to learn focus level 2, which was the point where I realized that I was just trying to do too much. So I had my one thing, which was GroupSpaces, which was membership management software for organizations, but we were just trying to do too many things. We were trying to do too many features, we were trying to work with too many partners, etc. And so my focus level 2 was to cut things out and to really narrow down the scope, to give ourselves a better chance of succeeding at something smaller, which was great. And it wasn't until the very later stages of the business when, we were struggling a bit because we were growing slowly, but it wasn't going as fast as we wanted to, when I really came to sort of have this realization of what I might call a minimum viable business, which is basically taking this idea of focus and just taking it to the really extreme level, which is where you have one product with like maybe just one feature that you're trying to take to one market with one unique selling point, one distribution channel, and one way of making money. And you see, I thought I was focused at GroupSpaces because we knew exactly who our customers were. We said our customers are clubs and societies. They're volunteer run. We're not going to target large staffed organizations. And we said we're just doing membership management software. We're not going to do collaboration software. We're just going to do membership and communications. We're not going to do to-do lists. We're not going to do working together. We're not going to do project management. We're focused. But the problem was that we had 3 different ways where we could make money from that product. And we had 3 different ways where we were trying to find customers and find users. And so we weren't doing one focused thing. We were doing 6 different things. And with a small team, with limited resources, that was something that I think really set us back. And if I had my time over, I would really try and get right much earlier on. So there's this crucial idea of having one of everything on this list. And so when you put them together, they all line up. And you can just say, if I get all these in order, then everything just falls into place. So that's kind of where I reached at the end of my journey learning about focus with GroupSpaces. I'm thinking now about whether there's this focus level 4, which is taking what I had before, but then limiting yourself to only work on improving 1 or 2 things at any one time. So you might say, this month I'm just going to work on getting more customers, and I'm not going to worry about trying to improve how happy they are or whether they're giving me more money. I'm just going to focus on that one thing and spend, with a small team, maybe just do one thing at a time and spend all these resources and see if we can really move the needle there. And then maybe when we've tried that, next month we'll do things like try and make more money out of our customers, for example. So maybe that's focus level 4. But the interesting thing for me was taking it back, and so one word, being focused. It sounds great, but this applies to so much advice that it's only once you really get in the trenches that it starts to really make sense. And so hopefully by thinking about things in that way and maybe hearing about the learning journey where I went through learning about focus, I can help some of you falling into the same traps. So talking about advice and talking about how not to drown from too much advice or advice that's contradictory or conflicting. Basically summarizing, I fully recommend go out there, seek advice. As Demetrios said, don't listen to all of it. I assume he means listen to the advice that he gave, but choose what other advice you're not going to listen to. Try and understand the context and the assumptions. So as I was saying, where are people coming from when they tell you the one true way that they've discovered? What is their context? What have they done that they've learnt these things? I found a really interesting realization when at the beginning of the year when I was thinking about what I would be doing next with my life, and I went and had lunch with a friend who'd been in a similar position, and we'd both run companies for a couple of years. We'd both been funded. Both companies had done okay, but not been the big success we'd hoped for. And we were both in the position where we were thinking about what we did next. And what was striking to me was how, having gone through completely similar experiences, we actually wanted to do, we were both planning on starting a new company at that time, but we both had a completely different way of going about it. His experience was that on his previous company, he had sat down with a bunch of close friends that all respected each other, smart people, and thought, what can we do together? And try to come up with ideas. And so his learning was that that didn't work out, so he was going to take it slow, start by himself, and experiment with ideas until he found the idea that he thought was worth working on, at which point he was going to go out and try and find other people to work on it with. Whereas my approach was, my learning was that I thought I wanted to build something that had a chance of being big, and the way I saw the world was that big things are built by small teams of great people. So my approach was to go right out there and say, hey, well, I'm not really sure about the idea at this stage, but maybe we should start working together. And so based on similar experiences, we decided to go in completely opposite directions. And the key thing is that neither of those directions were necessarily wrong. And so, make strong choices. I think this is the point that at the end of the day, it all comes down to ourselves as the entrepreneurs, as the startup people. It's down to us. And there was a big learning I had working with my board of directors at GroupSpaces. I mentioned we had angel investors who invested, and then later on we had venture capital investors that invested. And that was great, but what happened is we came to the board meetings, monthly board meetings, and I'd end up getting conflicting advice in the board. And so the angel investors who'd invested maybe a couple of £100,000, they had a perspective where for them that was quite a lot of money. And for them they were focused on building a business but minimizing the downside. Whereas the venture capital investors who'd put in maybe 3 or 4 times as much money, but for them that money was very small compared to the amounts of money they were putting into bigger, later stage companies. So for them, they weren't really concerned if our company failed. What they cared about was maximizing the chance that we really built something big. And so they were motivating us to go and do things like try and look for ways where we could grow our company quickly, grow our user base quickly, whilst the angel investors were saying, well, we should be working out how we're making money first. And it was this conflicting advice. And the mistake I made was that I didn't make a choice clear enough, and I didn't say, this is the direction we're going in. I want to build a company that looks like this, and this advice is good advice, but it doesn't apply to my vision and my situation. So instead, I ended up doing a little bit of everything, a little bit of working on trying to make a company that made money, and a little bit on trying to find ways where we could grow our business quickly. And we ended up smack bang in the middle in no man's land, which was a big learning for me. And so the key thing there was not to hedge myself. and not to try and offset the big wins by minimizing the downside. So that's the thing, that it's our opportunity as you know, it's our baby, what we're working on, and we need to take all this advice on board, but ultimately understand it and then figure out where we want to go with it. Now, getting towards the end, but this is a really key point that I really like from Mark Suster. I don't know if you've seen, I'm a big fan of his blog. Avoid decision by indecision, which is a similar takeaway to what I just described. And what he's wrote a blog post here, which I recommend, but essentially what he's talking about is if you're thinking whether you should do something or go in a direction and waiting for so long because you're not sure which way to go, the decision ends up being made for you. So an example is if you're thinking about hiring someone, but you're not really sure whether it'll be good working with them, and maybe you try and get more references for them, or you think about it for a bit longer, and what happens is they end up getting bored waiting, or take another offer elsewhere, or start having second thoughts about whether, you know, they'd really like to be working with you themselves. Or another one, which, you know, is very familiar to myself, is if you're, say, working on a software company and you're trying to think about whether you're selling to big enterprises or whether you're selling to small businesses, and if you delay making that decision and you end up creating features that are okay for both large companies and small companies, but they're great for nobody. And so, again, you end up failing to build a product that really impresses and succeeds the way it should. And the problem is that you've made a decision by indecision and you don't even know that it's happened. So Mark's point here is, I think it's a really great one. It's that maybe 70% of the time we'll be right, and the rest of the time we'll be wrong. But it doesn't matter as long as when we realize we're wrong, we correct it quickly. Because the key thing is that by doing that, we're still going to be right more of the time by making those early decisions than if we just like delay and defer and water around in the advice we get and don't strive forward. And finally, this is another great blog post which I'd recommend to everybody, from Sam Altman, founder of Looped and now partner at Y Combinator, who's wrote a great post. I can't remember how many bullet points it is about startup advice, maybe something 50 or 70. But it was a really strong takeaway, I think, that puts this whole talk into context, which is, you know, you often hear conflicting advice about everything but build a great product, which I think is true in my experience. Building a great product is, you know, is the key thing to really make a breakout success, certainly as a growth company, not fueled by sales. And his point here was that means that basically you can kind of go either way on the rest of it, and it doesn't really matter, just so you pick your direction. So that's all I got. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope it was useful.